Maple Ridge, Ohio. 2 in the morning. The fluorescent lights hum like a trapped insect vibrating against the inside of my skull. I am Layla Norris, and I am sitting in a plastic chair while a deputy guards the door. Across the room, my niece and nephew are shivering under heavy wool blankets, their eyes wide with a terror I am accused of causing. I walked into this station thinking I was the family safety net. I didn't realize I was actually the prey. My parents are waiting in the lobby, but they aren't here to save me. They are here to make sure the trap snaps shut. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The hum of the fluorescent lights in the sheriff's station was so loud, it felt like it was vibrating inside my skull. It was 2 in the morning in Maple Ridge, Ohio, and the air smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. I sat on a hard plastic chair, my hands shaking uncontrollably in my lap, staring down at a styrofoam cup I hadn't touched. I was wearing my scrubs still stained with a speck of blood from a trauma case earlier that night, but the exhaustion I felt went deeper than just a double shift. I kept waiting for someone to tell me this was a mistake. I kept waiting for my parents to burst through the heavy double doors and tell the deputies to back off. But the doors stayed shut. A deputy I didn't recognize walked past the interrogation room's open door. He was guiding 2 small figures wrapped in heavy wool law enforcement blankets. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was Liam and Hazel, my 8-year-old nephew and 5-year-old niece. They looked terrified, their faces streaked with dried tears and grime. They were clinging to each other in a way that made my stomach turn over. I started to stand up, instinct taking over, but Sheriff Miller stepped into my line of sight, blocking the door. I had known Miller for years. I'd treated his wife's hypertension in the ER, but tonight he didn't look at me like a neighbor or a nurse. He looked at me like a suspect. "Ms. Norris," he said, his voice calm but undeniably cold. "Sit down. We need to talk about why your sister's children were found alone in an abandoned campground in the middle of a freezing storm looking for you." The room seemed to tilt. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. I had come down here because I got a call saying the kids were safe and they needed a guardian. I thought I was here as family. I thought I was the safety net. Staring into Miller's hard eyes, the reality finally hit me. I wasn't the savior in this scenario. I was the one being ambushed. To understand how I ended up in that chair, you have to understand the role I was born into. In the Norris family, there were 2 distinct categories for children. There was my older sister Tessa, the beautiful, dramatic, high-potential golden child whose chaos was always framed as passion. And then there was me, Layla, the responsible one. My parents, Frank and Marlene, were deeply respected in our local church and obsessed with the image of a perfect working-class American family. They preached the gospel of sacrifice, but looking back, I realized they only ever demanded it from one of us. I spent my 20s cleaning up messes I didn't make. When my friends moved to Seattle or Chicago after high school, chasing that American promise of personal freedom and reinvention, I stayed in Maple Ridge. My parents told me I could be anything I wanted, but there was always a silent, heavy caveat attached to that permission. I could be anything as long as it didn't inconvenience the family. So I went to nursing school 20 minutes down the road. I took the brutal overnight shifts at the ER, not just for the differential pay, but so I could be awake during the day to help Tessa with the kids when her latest crisis hit. I paid my parents' utility bills when Frank's hours got cut. I paid for the transmission repair on their sedan. I became the infrastructure upon which they built their comfortable, chaotic lives. But even infrastructure has a breaking point. The cracks started showing the week before the sheriff picked me up. I was finally building something just for me. I was up for a promotion to charge nurse, and I had been dedicating my limited free time to a project with a community clinic that had the potential to transfer me to Columbus. It meant more autonomy, better pay, and for the first time, distance. That was when Tessa called. It was her anniversary, and her sitter had bailed. She didn't ask if I was free, she just told me what time to be there. "I need you to take Liam and Hazel tonight," she said, breathless and assuming. For the first time in my life, I didn't just roll over. I was scheduled for a double shift. The forecast called for a severe winter storm, the kind that turns Ohio roads into sheets of black ice. "No," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "I can't. I'm at the hospital, I have patients, and I won't be home. Do not drop them off." I knew how my sister operated, so I didn't stop there. I sent a follow-up text and an email to create a paper trail explicitly stating, "I will not be home tonight. I am at work. Do not bring the children to my house. I will not answer the door." It felt like a triumph at the moment, a crucial boundary finally set. I told myself it was just one night. But as I sat in that interrogation room, I realized that was the moment the trap was set. It was the first time I chose my own survival over my family's convenience, and my parents never forgave me for it. My mind flashed through the years of subtle abuse I had ignored. The guilt trips when I missed a cousin's baby shower because I was working a 12-hour shift to pay my student loans, Frank shaking his head saying, "We sacrificed everything for you kids and this is how you repay us." Marlene whispering in the kitchen, "If you'd just be more accommodating like Tessa, we'd all be happier." They didn't see me as a daughter. They saw me as a resource that had suddenly malfunctioned. I looked up at Sheriff Miller, the fluorescent lights humming their electric song of accusation. I thought saying no to babysitting would simply disappoint them. I didn't know it would make my parents and my sister try to erase me completely. To understand the depth of the betrayal, you have to go back just a few hours before I found myself in that interrogation room. I was mid-shift in the ER, and it was the kind of night that nightmares are made of. The winter storm had turned the highways into slick traps, and we were drowning in car wrecks, slips on ice, and a nasty flu strain that had the waiting room bursting at the seams. I was running on adrenaline and caffeine, moving from one crisis to the next. Somewhere between stabilizing a teenager with a broken femur and checking vitals on an elderly asthmatic, I checked my phone. There was a single missed call from Tessa and a text message that sat on the screen like a dormant landmine. "You'll regret this, Layla. Family comes first." I didn't have time to decode the threat. I shoved the phone back into my scrub pocket and ran to a code blue in Bay 4. While I was fighting to keep a stranger's heart beating, my own family was setting me up to look like a monster. Back in the station, the sheriff's voice brought me back to the cold, sterile reality. Miller leaned forward, clasping his hands on the table. He told me that Liam and Hazel hadn't just been found wandering the streets. They were discovered at the old Norris family campground, a dilapidated property 10 miles out of town that I hadn't set foot on since I was 15. An older couple staying in an RV nearby had heard crying over the wind. They found my niece and nephew huddled under a picnic shelter, freezing in light jackets, asking strangers if they had seen Aunt Layla. When the deputies arrived, the kids told them a story that made my blood run cold. "Mom said Aunt Layla wanted us to come. She said Aunt Layla gave the address." "I haven't been to that campground in over a decade," I said, my voice rising in panic. "Why would I tell them to go there?" Miller didn't blink. He slid a piece of paper across the metal table. It was a printout of a rideshare receipt. My eyes scanned the data and my stomach dropped. The pickup address was Tessa's house. The drop-off was the campground. The timestamp was from earlier that evening, right when I was intubating a patient. But the kicker was the user note left for the driver. "Their Aunt Layla is waiting for them at the cabin." "I didn't book this," I whispered. "Then why?" Miller asked, tapping the paper. "Does it say this was booked from your account?" I unlocked my phone with trembling fingers and opened the app. There it was. A completed trip I had never taken paid for with my card. The realization hit me instantly. Years ago, I had given Tessa my login password so she could use a first-time rider promo code. I never changed it. Why would I? She was my sister. I looked up at Miller, desperate. "She has my password. She logged in as me." Miller looked skeptical, leaning back in his chair. "People change passwords, Ms. Norris. Parents sacrifice for their family. They don't send their kids into a storm. Why would your sister send her own children somewhere unsafe just to frame you?" The word sacrifice stung. It was the weapon my parents had honed against me my entire life, and now the law was wielding it too. Check her ring camera, I demanded. If she sent them, the footage will show it. Miller sighed. We tried. Your sister said there was a technical glitch. We have one still image of the kids leaving with backpacks looking rushed. But there's no audio and no video of who pushed them out the door. It's not enough to clear you. Before I could argue, my phone on the table lit up. Then it lit up again. And again. A torrent of notifications flooded the screen. I tapped Facebook and felt the air leave my lungs. Tessa had posted a photo of Liam and Hazel wrapped in police blankets at the station. The caption was a masterclass in manipulation. When your own sister would rather chase a promotion than care for her family. My kids were left alone in the cold because of Layla Norris. I'll never forgive this betrayal. The comments were already pouring in from church ladies' neighbors and even some of my co-workers. How could she? Blood should always come first. Monster. In less than 10 minutes, my parents and sister had decided I was guilty without asking me a single question. That was when the heavy doors opened. Frank and Marlene walked in. They didn't look at me with concern. They looked like they were walking onto a stage. Marlene was sobbing theatrically, clutching Frank's arm. Frank looked grim, the picture of a disappointed patriarch. They asked for a moment alone with me, and Miller obliged, stepping out. The second the door clicked shut, the performance dropped. Frank didn't hug me. He leaned in close, his voice low and dangerous. We didn't raise you like this, Layla. You need to fix this. Fix what? I hissed. Tessa hacked my account. She sent her kids to the woods to punish me. Marlene grabbed my wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. Don't make us choose between you and those terrified children. Tell the sheriff you made a mistake. Tell him you gave the driver the wrong address by accident. Tell him you're exhausted from work. You want me to lie to say I endangered them? If you don't, Frank interrupted, his eyes hard. We'll have to tell the sheriff about your history of neglect. We'll tell him you've been unstable lately, selfish. I looked at them, really looked at them, and realized the terrifying truth. My parents weren't here to protect me. They were here to erase me to save the reputation of their favorite daughter. I could have folded. A week ago, the old Layla, the peacemaker, the fixer, would have crumbled under the weight of my parents' disappointment. But staring at the wall of that interrogation room had broken something inside me, or perhaps it had finally forged something stronger. Instead of signing a false confession to protect the people who framed me, I made 2 calls. The first was to my union representative at the hospital to secure my employment records. The second was to Alicia Moreno, a shark of a family law attorney known for chewing up bullies in court. Alicia didn't offer sympathy. She offered strategy. She told me to stay quiet, gather every scrap of digital evidence, and let them think they were winning until it was too late to back out. My parents, sensing my silence was a crack in the armor, requested a meeting to talk like family. We met at a neutral diner on the edge of town. Frank and Marlene sat on the same side of the booth, a united front of gray-haired disapproval. They didn't order food. Instead, Frank reached into his jacket pocket and slid a cashier's check across the Formica table. I glanced at the amount, $40,000. It was almost exactly the balance of my student loans. The memo line was blank. You say it was an honest mistake, Frank said, his voice low and devoid of warmth. You tell the sheriff you were exhausted, you mixed up the addresses. We back you up. We tell everyone we forgive you publicly. The investigation goes away. Marlene leaned in, her eyes wide with fake concern. You've always sacrificed so much, Layla. Just do this one last thing for the family. Take the money, pay off your debts, and we can all move on. My hand slipped under the table, tapping the record button on my phone. I needed them to say it. And what about the truth? I asked, keeping my voice steady. What about the fact that Tessa logged into my account? No one has to know Tessa used your account, Frank said, clearly the trap snapping shut around his own words. If you take this check, we never mention it to anyone. We bury it. And if I don't, Marlene's face hardened, the mask slipping completely. Then we make sure everyone knows you threatened to abandon your niece and nephew. We will erase you, Layla. No holidays, no birthdays. You'll be completely alone. I looked at the check, then at the people who raised me. They thought the threat of being alone would break me. They didn't understand that they had just handed me the key to my freedom. I picked up the check, held their gaze, and tore it in half. Then I tore it again. You really think this money can buy my silence? I stood up, my legs trembling but holding firm. Do not use my name in the same sentence as the word family, ever again. If you lie in court, I will burn your reputation to the ground. I walked out to the sound of Frank shouting that I was no daughter of his, narrating to myself that they hadn't exiled me. They had liberated me. The war came 3 days later in family court. Tessa had filed an emergency petition claiming I had sabotaged the ride out of jealousy and hatred for her children. The courtroom was packed. My parents had rallied the troops, church members, neighbors, and even some of my colleagues were there whispering in the pews. Tessa arrived looking polished and tragic, a grieving mother protecting her cubs from her unstable sister. I sat alone with Alicia, who looked calm, almost bored. We can't just argue feelings, Alicia had told me beforehand. We need her to commit to the lie under oath. Once she's on the record, we cut the floor out from under her. Tessa took the stand, tears glistening in her eyes. She testified that I had agreed to watch the kids, that I had texted her the address for the campground, and that I had booked the ride myself. Every lie was spoken clearly under oath, with Frank and Marlene nodding solemnly from the front row. The judge asked if there were any questions on cross-examination. Alicia stood up, smoothed her blazer, and said, "Just a few, Your Honor." Alicia didn't yell. She systematically dismantled my sister's life. First, she presented the hospital time logs. "Ms. Norris," Alicia said, projecting to the back of the room. "Can you explain how Layla booked a ride on her phone at 7:14 p.m. when hospital security footage and electronic medical records show she was performing CPR on a cardiac arrest patient in Trauma Room 1 at that exact minute?" Tessa stammered, looking at our parents. Alicia didn't let up. She projected the IP address logs. "And can you explain why the login to Layla's rideshare account originated from the IP address assigned to your home router?" The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. But the final blow was the audio. Alicia played the recording from the diner. Frank's voice boomed through the quiet courtroom. "No one has to know Tessa used your account." Then Marlene's voice, sharp and cruel. "We can erase you, Layla." The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The church ladies gasped. Reporters started scribbling furiously. Frank and Marlene turned pale, shrinking into their seats as the eyes of their community turned on them with judgment. The judge, a stern woman with zero patience for manipulation, stared at Tessa. "You perjured yourself," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. "You endangered your own children to punish your sister, and your parents attempted to bribe a witness." The verdict was swift and brutal. Child Protective Services was ordered to open an immediate investigation into Tessa. Temporary custody of Liam and Hazel was awarded to their father, Tessa's ex-husband, with me named as the emergency guardian. The judge recommended criminal charges for fraud and perjury against Tessa, and obstruction of justice charges for my parents. As the gavel banged down, I looked across the aisle. My parents were staring at me with pure hatred, but for the first time in my life, I didn't feel small. I felt steady. I was shaking, yes, but not from fear. I was shaking from the unfamiliar electric sensation of victory. The immediate aftermath of the verdict wasn't the cinematic celebration people imagine. It was a chaotic, suffocating blur. Tessa wasn't in handcuffs yet, but she was flanked by two stern-faced caseworkers from Child Protective Services and her own shell-shocked attorney. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her, stripped of the arrogance that usually armored her against the world. But it was my parents' reaction that cut the deepest. They didn't run to comfort their daughter or ask about their grandchildren. They turned on me. Frank cornered me near the exit, his face a mask of purple rage, and hissed, You've destroyed this family. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a stranger. I didn't destroy it, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the adrenaline crashing through my system. I stopped you from destroying me. Walking out of the courthouse felt like stepping into a different reality. Reporters were waiting on the steps, hungry for a soundbite about the aunt who sued her sister. They shouted questions, microphones thrust in my face, asking if I felt guilty, if I hated my sister. I stopped for exactly 1 second, looked into a camera lens and said, I protected my niece and nephew. That's all. Then I walked to my car, got in, and drove straight to the hospital. I didn't know if I was returning as a hero or a liability. I walked into the ER bracing myself to be fired. I assumed the scandal would be too much for the administration. Instead, my supervisor called me into her office and closed the door. She didn't hand me a termination slip, she handed me a tissue. The hospital legal team had reviewed the court filings. They knew I had been at work saving lives while my family was busy framing me. When I walked back out to the nurses' station, the atmosphere had shifted. Coworkers who had given me the cold shoulder days earlier looked down at their charts ashamed. One of them, a tech named Sarah who had commented on Tessa's Facebook post, stopped me in the hallway. I didn't know, she whispered. I'm so sorry, Layla. The community was split down the middle, a fracture running right through the heart of Maple Ridge. The church crowd, the people who had idolized Frank and Marlene for decades, didn't know what to do with the truth. Some quietly distanced themselves from my parents, horrified by the audio recording. Others, the die-hard traditionalists, whispered in the grocery store aisles that I shouldn't have taken private matters to court, as if child endangerment was a private family quirk. But I found I didn't care about their whispers anymore. I was too busy building a real life. I spent my evenings at Noah's house. Tessa's ex-husband had been granted temporary full custody, and he was a good man trying to navigate a nightmare. We fell into a rhythm born of necessity. I'd come over after my shift to help with homework or cook dinner while he managed the legal fallout. The trauma, however, was still fresh for the kids. One night, Liam woke up screaming. I ran into his room to find him thrashing in his sheets, sobbing about the dark and the cold. He grabbed my arm, his grip bruising. Are you going to send me away? He choked out. Mom said you wanted us gone. I sat on the edge of his bed, smoothing his hair back, my heart breaking all over again. Listen to me, Liam, I said, making sure he saw my eyes. Nobody is ever going to sacrifice you to teach me a lesson again. You are safe, I promise. Later that night, Hazel, who had been quiet for weeks, tugged on my sleeve while I was washing dishes. She looked up at me with wide, confused eyes. Aunt Layla, she asked, are you still in the family? I dried my hands and crouched down to her level. You and Liam are my family, Hazel. And Noah. That's what matters. My parents, however, refused to let go. They launched a campaign of digital harassment that cycled through every stage of grief. First came the angry voicemails. We'll never forgive you for this betrayal. Then the pleading ones. We're your parents, Layla. You can't just shut us out. We're old. Then the manipulation returned sharper than before. People are talking. You've made us look like monsters. You need to fix this. The final message came on a Tuesday night. It was Frank. If you don't come to the house and apologize, don't bother coming back at all. We will wash our hands of you. I listened to it in the quiet of my apartment. A month ago, that threat would have paralyzed me. I would have begged for their love. But now I realized their favorite weapon, the threat of erasing me, had lost its ammunition. I wasn't afraid of disappearing from their twisted story anymore because I was finally writing my own. I hit delete without responding. The legal and emotional aftershocks continued to ripple outward. Tessa accepted a plea deal that involved intensive rehab and a suspended sentence, effectively losing custody for the foreseeable future. Frank and Marlene's social standing crumbled. They were asked to step down from the church committees they had ruled for years. But victory didn't cure the pain. I was grieving the parents I wished I'd had, not the ones I actually got. I started therapy trying to untangle the years of conditioning. During one session, after I spent an hour listing all the things I no longer had to do for my family, my therapist looked at me and asked a question that stopped me cold. If you're no longer the designated caretaker for your parents and sister, who do you want to be? It took 3 years to answer my therapist's question, but I finally found the answer in the very place my family tried to destroy me. I am 32 now, and I'm no longer just the ER nurse who takes the extra shifts to avoid going home. I accepted a leadership role as the director of community outreach at the clinic, running programs specifically designed to catch the signs of family violence and child neglect that often slip through the cracks. Sometimes when I'm sitting with a scared young mother or a teenager who thinks they owe their parents their sanity, I tell them a story. I change the names and the details, but I tell them about a woman who realized that love isn't supposed to cost you your soul. I tell them that no is a complete sentence. The physical manifestation of my recovery is the project that consumes my weekends. We call it the Safe Haven Cabin Project. With the help of local donors and a swarm of volunteers, we bought the old abandoned campground, the same property where Liam and Hazel were left freezing in the dark. We spent months tearing down the rotting wood and clearing out the debris. We scrubbed away the neglect and built something beautiful in its place. It is now a supervised retreat for families rebuilding after crisis, a place where the woods are no longer scary, but a sanctuary. The very geography of my trauma has been terraformed into a symbol of second chances. My life is populated by a new cast of characters, a community chosen not by blood but by shared values. Noah is my best friend and co-parenting partner, a steady rock who stepped up when it mattered. The older couple who found the kids that night, the Millers, come over for Sunday dinner once a month. They are the grandparents Liam and Hazel deserve. And then there is David. He's a pediatrician at the clinic, a man with kind eyes and infinite patience. It's a slow burn, nothing dramatic or chaotic like the relationships I saw growing up. He respects my boundaries. When I say I need time, he gives it. He doesn't see me as a resource to be mined. He sees me as a partner. It's a terrifying, wonderful difference. I still have ghosts, of course. You can't amputate your history without feeling the phantom limb. I hear about Frank and Marlene in passing sometimes. They moved 2 towns over, trying to outrun the scandal and rebuild their image as the pious, perfect couple. They sent a Christmas card last year, no return address, just a picture of a generic nativity scene and a Bible verse about forgiveness, scribbled in my mother's shaky handwriting. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the damage. They still wanted the daughter who fixed things, not the woman who spoke the truth. I looked at the card for a long moment, feeling that old tug of guilt, then walked to the kitchen and dropped it into the trash. In their story, I was the ungrateful daughter who destroyed the family. In mine, I am the woman who refused to let my parents sacrifice me to protect their favorite child. I prefer my version. The real legacy of that night, however, isn't my career or the cabins. It's the kids. Last month, Liam stood on stage at his middle school speech contest. He's taller now, his shoulders losing that permanent hunch of anxiety. His speech was about the definition of family. He didn't mention Tessa Frank or Marlene by name. He didn't have to. He talked about an aunt who chose to tell the truth when lying would have been easier. He talked about how family isn't the blood that runs through your veins, but the people who stand in the storm with you. I sat in the audience, holding David's hand, crying quietly as the applause washed over us. Later that same week, Hazel gave me a framed drawing. It was a picture of the campground as it looks now: bright colors, flowers, a big yellow sun, and stick figures roasting marshmallows. At the bottom, in her neat looping cursive, she had written, "For Aunt Layla, who never erased me." That piece of paper hangs in my office, worth more to me than any nursing degree or accolade. On the anniversary of the ambush, I stood at the edge of the refurbished campground. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the fire pit where Liam, Hazel, and a group of other kids were laughing and roasting marshmallows. The air smelled of wood smoke and sugar, not fear. I watched them, feeling a profound sense of peace settle in my chest. My parents had ambushed me with guilt. They sacrificed my dreams to keep their favorite story alive. They threatened to erase me if I didn't play along. They were wrong. I took a deep breath of the crisp evening air, watching the sparks rise from the fire into the darkening sky. They tried to erase me from the family. Instead, I erased their power over me. What's left is mine, and that finally is enough. Layla finally took that deep breath of freedom, proving that the family you choose is always stronger than the family you inherit. Let us know your thoughts on Layla's final stand in the comments. Was she right to erase their power? We read every single comment of your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe for more narratives. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Revenge Hour. We'll see you next time.